He wasn't supposed to go back there, not after everything he had buried, not after the silence he had learned to live with, but some places don't let you stay gone, and some doors remember who you are long before you touch them. The mansion stood at the end of a narrow gravel road just outside a forgotten coastal town in Maine, its windows dark, its paint weathered into a dull grey that seemed to drink the late afternoon light. And as Ethan Cole stepped out of his truck, boots crunching softly over loose stone, the air carried a faint scent of salt and old wood, the kind that settles into your lungs and lingers like a memory you never asked for. Beside him, Rex didn't move, the German shepherd's muscular frame tense, ears angled forward, amber eyes locked on the house as if it were something alive, something watching back, and for a moment, neither of them crossed the threshold of the yard, just stood there in the quiet, the wind brushing through dry grass, the distant cry of a gull cutting across the sky. Ethan adjusted the worn strap of his duffel bag over his shoulder, the weight familiar, grounding, but this place felt different, heavier in a way he couldn't explain, like stepping into a story that had already begun without him. The letter from the attorney had been simple, almost careless in tone, stating that Margaret Hale, his grandmother, had passed quietly in her sleep and left him her estate. No ceremony, no sentiment, just a set of keys and an address no one else in the family had wanted, and that alone had been enough to raise suspicion, because nothing in his life had ever come without a cost. Rex let out a low, almost inaudible rumble, not a bark, not fear, something deeper, older, and Ethan glanced down, his voice steady but softer than he intended. "It's just a house, buddy," but the words didn't hold, not even to his own ears, because Rex wasn't looking at the house anymore. He was staring at the front door, unmoving, as if waiting for it to open on its own. The wind shifted then, colder, slipping through the cracked boards of the porch, and somewhere inside, a faint creak echoed, the kind that comes from old wood settling, or something shifting where it shouldn't be, and Rex's posture changed instantly, his body lowering slightly, muscles coiled, not aggressive, but alert in a way Ethan had only seen in the field, when danger didn't announce itself, when instinct had to speak first. Ethan exhaled slowly, forcing himself forward, one step, then another, the gravel giving way to warped wooden planks beneath his boots, each step answered by a hollow sound that seemed to travel deeper into the structure, as if the house were listening. And when he reached the door, he hesitated, fingers brushing against the cold metal of the key, a simple object that suddenly felt heavier than it should, like it carried more than just entry, like it carried a choice. Behind him, Rex finally moved, but not toward the door, instead circling once, then stopping just to the side, eyes fixed on a section of the wall where the paint had peeled away, revealing older wood beneath, darker, almost stained, and he let out a soft whine, the kind that doesn't ask for attention but demands to be understood, and Ethan felt it then, that quiet, unsettling pull, not fear, not exactly, but recognition without memory, like standing in a place you've never been and somehow knowing you've been there before. The key turned with a dull click, louder than it should have been, and as the door eased open, a breath of cold air slipped out from the darkness inside, carrying with it the scent of dust, time, and something else he couldn't name, something that made Rex take a single step back, just one, before steadying himself again, as if whatever waited beyond that doorway wasn't just part of the past, but something that had been waiting for them all along. The inside of the house did not welcome them, it simply revealed itself, slow and unwilling, like a place that had forgotten what it meant to be lived in, and as Ethan stepped across the threshold the floor beneath him answered with a long, tired creak that echoed deeper than the size of the room should have allowed, the air colder here, carrying the dry scent of dust layered over years and something faintly metallic, like old hinges or forgotten tools, and the light that slipped in through the open door stretched thin across the floorboards, barely reaching the far corners where shadows gathered thick and unmoving. Rex followed after a pause, one careful step at a time, his nails clicking softly against the wood, his head low, ears flicking at sounds Ethan could not hear, and when the door drifted shut behind them with a dull, final thud, the silence that settled felt heavier, complete, as if the outside world had quietly stepped away. Ethan stood still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, taking in the outline of what had once been a living room, a long couch draped in a sheet that had yellowed with age, a stone fireplace cold and empty, and along the far wall, a narrow hallway that seemed to pull the light away from it, swallowing it inch by inch. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself, the familiar discipline returning, the way it always did when something felt off but not yet understood, and he set his duffel down near the door, the soft thud grounding him in the present. "Stay close," he murmured, though Rex was already there, moving ahead just enough to scan, then circling back, his behavior precise, controlled, not fear, not curiosity, but something closer to recognition. A faint sound broke the stillness then, not loud, not sharp, just a subtle shift, like wood settling or a distant door brushing against its frame, and Rex froze instantly, his body tightening, head snapping toward the hallway. A low vibration building in his chest that never quite became a growl, and Ethan felt it too, that quiet tightening in the air, the sense that the house was not empty in the way abandoned places usually were, but occupied by something less tangible, something that lingered in the spaces between walls. He moved forward, slow and deliberate, each step measured, passing the covered furniture, the edges of frames hanging slightly crooked on the walls, photographs obscured by dust, faces hidden behind time. And as he reached the mouth of the hallway, the temperature seemed to drop again, just enough to raise the fine hairs along his arms, and the light dimmed in a way that felt unnatural, as if the space itself resisted being seen. Rex stepped ahead this time, without hesitation, his nose lifting, drawing in the air, then lowering again as he moved down the narrow passage, stopping halfway, his focus fixed on a section of the right wall where nothing seemed out of place, no door, no marking, just aged wood and peeling paint, and yet he stood there, unmoving, as if something beneath the surface had called to him. Ethan followed, slower now, his gaze shifting from the dog to the wall, searching for anything that might explain it, and for a moment there was nothing, just silence and stillness, until he noticed it, faint but deliberate, a line in the wood, almost invisible unless you were looking for it, running vertically from floor to shoulder height, too straight to be natural, too precise to be damage. He reached out, fingers brushing the surface, the wood colder than the rest of the house, and as his hand moved along that hidden seam, Rex let out a soft, urgent whine, stepping closer, pressing his nose against the exact spot where Ethan's hand paused, and something in that moment shifted, not in the house, but in Ethan himself, a quiet certainty forming where doubt had been, the feeling that this place had not been left to him by accident, that whatever waited behind that wall had been meant for him, or perhaps for the one standing beside him, the one who seemed to remember what Ethan could not. The moment his fingers pressed along the hidden seam, something gave way beneath the surface, not with force, but with a quiet surrender, a soft click that seemed too deliberate to be chance, and the wall shifted just enough to reveal a narrow outline, a door disguised so carefully it had waited years without being noticed, and Rex stepped back instinctively, not in fear, but in anticipation, his eyes fixed, unblinking, as if this exact moment had been written somewhere deep within him long before they arrived. Ethan hesitated, his hand still resting against the wood, feeling the faint vibration of something unseen settling into place, and for a second, the house felt less like a structure and more like a witness, something that had held its breath for decades and was only now beginning to exhale. He pulled gently, and the hidden door opened inward with a slow, measured motion, revealing a space beyond that was darker than the hallway, a small room sealed away from time, where the air carried a different weight, cooler, cleaner in a way that suggested it had not been disturbed in years. The light from the hallway stretched just far enough to outline the interior, and what it revealed made Ethan stop completely, not from shock, but from the quiet recognition that whatever this was, it mattered. The room was simple, almost sparse, but every object inside had been placed with intention, a wooden desk positioned against the far wall, a single chair tucked neatly beneath it, and above the desk, mounted carefully, was a frame containing a folded American flag, its colors muted by age but unmistakable, and beneath it, resting on the desk itself, lay a small metal box, worn at the edges, its surface scratched in a way that suggested it had traveled, had endured. Rex moved forward before Ethan could, his steps slow, deliberate, crossing the threshold as if stepping into something sacred, and when he reached the desk, he paused, lowering his head toward the box, inhaling deeply, then letting out a soft sound that was not quite a whine, not quite a breath, something in between, something that carried weight. Ethan followed, each step quieter than the last, the sense of intrusion replaced by something closer to obligation, and as he approached the desk, he noticed the details more clearly, the faint outline of handwriting etched into the wood itself, initials carved with care, MH, and beneath them, a date that had nearly faded but still held its shape, a mark left by someone who had known this place would one day be found. He reached for the metal box, his fingers brushing against the cool surface, and for a moment he did not open it, not yet, because something else had caught his attention, something just beside it, resting almost unnoticed. A leather collar, aged but intact, its surface worn smooth by time, and attached to it, a small tag that reflected the dim light just enough to draw the eye. Rex reacted instantly, his entire posture shifting, his body leaning forward as if pulled by something stronger than instinct, his nose pressing gently against the collar, and then he froze, completely still, as if the world around him had paused, and Ethan felt it again, that quiet pull, that sense that they were not just discovering something, but remembering it. He picked up the tag slowly, turning it just enough for the engraved letters to catch the light, and though the name was worn, nearly erased by years of neglect, one detail remained clear, a designation etched deeper than the rest, K9 unit, and beneath it, a number that felt less like an identifier and more like a story waiting to be told. And as Ethan looked down at Rex, who had not moved, who had not looked away, it became impossible to ignore the truth forming between them, that this house, this hidden room, and whatever had been left behind were not just part of his grandmother's past, but something that had reached forward, across time, to find them both. The tag felt heavier than its size should have allowed, as if the metal itself carried memory, and Ethan turned it slowly between his fingers, the faint scratches catching what little light reached the room, while Rex remained completely still, his gaze locked on that small object with a focus that went beyond curiosity, beyond training, something deeper, something that felt almost like recognition without explanation. Ethan lowered the tag back onto the desk beside the collar, his movements more careful now, as if he understood that every item here had been placed not just to be found, but to be understood in the right moment, and his attention shifted to the metal box resting at the center, its surface worn but intact, edges dulled by time, yet still holding together as though it had been waiting. He placed both hands on it, pausing for a breath, the silence in the room pressing in around him, and then he opened it. The hinges resisted at first, letting out a faint creak that echoed softly against the walls, and inside, neatly arranged, were documents, photographs, and a folded letter sealed with a strip of yellowed tape, all preserved with a care that felt deliberate, almost protective. Rex stepped closer, his nose hovering just above the contents, not touching, just sensing, and Ethan reached in, lifting the first photograph. Its edges curled slightly, the image faded but still clear enough to make out the figures within. It showed a younger version of the house, not abandoned, not silent, but alive, the paint fresh, the windows open, and standing in front of it was a woman Ethan recognized instantly, Margaret Hale, years younger, her posture strong, her expression calm. And beside her stood a man in uniform, his stance straight, composed, and at his side, a German shepherd, alert, steady, its ears forward, its gaze fixed on something beyond the frame. Ethan's breath slowed, his eyes tracing the image, noting the details, the way the dog stood close to the man, not just as a companion, but as something more, something bound by purpose. And as he lowered the photograph, Rex shifted, stepping closer to the desk, his nose brushing the edge of the image before pulling back, as if confirming something only he could sense. Ethan reached for the next item, unfolding a thin stack of papers, official forms marked with faded stamps and signatures, the text partially obscured by time but still readable in fragments, references to a unit, a designation that matched the tag, K9 unit, and mentions of a mission that had been classified, then redacted, lines of black ink covering details that were never meant to be seen again. He flipped through them slowly, each page adding weight to the story forming in his mind, a narrative of service, of something that had happened and then been deliberately hidden. And at the bottom of the stack, he found a name, barely legible but still present, attached to the K9 designation, and though the letters were worn, the connection felt immediate, undeniable. Rex let out a soft sound then, not loud, not urgent, but filled with something that made Ethan look down, and the dog's eyes met his, steady and searching, as if asking him to continue, to see it through. Ethan nodded slightly, more to himself than to Rex, and reached for the folded letter, the tape brittle beneath his fingers as he carefully peeled it away, the paper inside unfolding with a faint crackle, revealing handwriting that was unmistakable, steady, deliberate, and deeply personal. He began to read silently, his eyes moving across the lines, and with each word, the room seemed to grow quieter, the air heavier, as the voice of Margaret Hale emerged not as memory, but as something present, something waiting. And whatever she had left behind was no longer just a secret hidden in wood and dust, it was a truth that had been carried, protected, and now, finally, passed on to the one person who could not walk away from it, not anymore. The paper trembled slightly in Ethan's hands, not from weakness, but from the quiet weight of what it carried, and as his eyes moved across the lines, the voice of Margaret Hale unfolded with a calm that felt deliberate, almost measured, as if she had written each word knowing exactly when it would be read, knowing who would be standing in this room when the truth finally found its way back into the light. She did not begin with explanation. She began with an apology, simple and direct, written in steady ink that had not faded despite the years, and Ethan felt that first, not as information, but as intention, the kind that lingers long after the words are gone. Rex shifted closer, his body brushing lightly against Ethan's leg, grounding him, reminding him that he was not standing here alone, and Ethan exhaled slowly before continuing, his eyes scanning the next lines, where the story began to take shape, not in full detail, but in fragments that hinted at something larger, something carefully buried. She wrote of a man who had once stood in this very room, a soldier who carried more than duty, and of a dog who never left his side, not in the field, not in the quiet moments between, and not in the silence that followed when everything changed. The words did not describe events in full, they circled them, careful, restrained, but the meaning was there, clear enough for someone who understood what it meant to carry something unseen, to live with something that could not be spoken. Ethan paused, his gaze lifting briefly from the page, the room around him feeling smaller now, more focused, as if everything within it had been arranged to lead to this moment, and when he looked down again, the handwriting shifted slightly, the lines pressing deeper into the paper, as if the weight of what was being said had grown heavier even for the one who wrote it. She spoke of a decision, one that had been made not in fear, but in necessity, a choice to protect something that others would have erased, a truth that would have been lost if it had been left in the wrong hands. And though she never named it directly, Ethan could feel it in the space between the words, a mission that had not ended the way it should have, a story that had been rewritten before it could be told. Rex let out a low, soft sound then, and Ethan glanced down, seeing the dog's eyes fixed not on the letter, but on the collar resting beside the box, and for a moment, everything aligned, the photograph, the tag, the documents, and now this letter, all pointing toward something that had been hidden not out of shame, but out of protection. Ethan returned to the page, his focus sharpening as the final lines came into view, and this time, the words were direct, unmistakable, written not for anyone, but for him. She had known he would come, known he would not ignore it, and she had trusted that he would understand what needed to be done, not because of who he was in the present, but because of what he carried from the past, the same quiet sense of duty, the same refusal to leave something unfinished. The letter ended without flourish, without explanation, just a final sentence that lingered in the air even after his eyes moved away from the page, a sentence that did not demand action, but made it impossible to walk away. And as Ethan lowered the paper slowly, the silence returned, deeper now, filled with meaning rather than emptiness, and Rex stepped forward once more, placing himself beside the desk, his presence steady, unwavering, as if whatever had begun here long before they arrived was now moving again, not with urgency, but with purpose. And Ethan understood, not all at once, but enough to know that this house had not been left to him as an inheritance, but as a responsibility, one that had waited patiently for the moment it could finally be carried forward. The letter remained in his hand longer than necessary, not because he needed to read it again, but because letting go of it felt like stepping forward into something that could not be undone. And Ethan stood there in the quiet of the hidden room, the faint sound of wind brushing against the outer walls filtering in just enough to remind him that the world beyond still existed, even if it felt distant now. And Rex shifted beside him, not impatient, not restless, but present in a way that anchored the moment, his steady breathing the only rhythm in a space that had held its silence for years. Ethan finally folded the letter carefully along its original lines, placing it back into the box with a precision that bordered on respect, and as his hand withdrew, his gaze returned to the items laid out before him, the photograph, the documents, the collar, each one no longer separate pieces but parts of a single story that had been waiting to be assembled. Rex moved then, slowly, circling the desk once, his nose tracing the edge of the wood, pausing briefly at each object as if confirming their place, and when he reached the far corner, he stopped again, his attention shifting toward something Ethan had not yet noticed, a small drawer built into the side of the desk, nearly flush with the frame, its outline barely visible unless you were looking directly at it. Ethan stepped closer, following Rex's focus, and knelt slightly, running his fingers along the edge until he felt the slight indentation of a handle, worn smooth by time, and when he pulled, the drawer resisted for a moment before sliding open with a soft, reluctant motion. Inside, there was only one item, a folded piece of fabric, darker than the rest of the room, its edges tucked neatly as if it had been placed there with intention rather than stored away. Ethan lifted it carefully, unfolding it just enough to reveal what it was: a patch. Military issue, the stitching faded but intact, bearing an emblem that matched the designation he had seen in the documents, K9 unit, and beneath it, a symbol that felt less official and more personal, something added, something that had meaning. Beyond rank or assignment, Rex reacted instantly, his posture shifting again, his body lowering slightly as he leaned closer, his nose hovering just above the patch, and for a moment, he did not move, did not breathe in any noticeable way, as if the scent alone was enough to hold him there, suspended between what was and what had been. Ethan watched him, something tightening quietly in his chest, not fear, not confusion, but recognition, not of the object itself, but of the way Rex responded to it, the way his entire being seemed to align with something unseen, something remembered without memory. He placed the patch gently on the desk beside the collar, and as he did, the arrangement of the items shifted in meaning, no longer artifacts, but connections, threads of a story that had been preserved not for history, but for resolution. Ethan stood slowly, his gaze moving across the room once more, taking in the flag, the desk, the objects that had been hidden away, and for the first time since he had arrived, the house did not feel uncertain. It felt intentional, as if every step he had taken had been guided, not by chance, but by something left behind to be found. Rex turned then, stepping away from the desk and moving toward the doorway, pausing just at the threshold, his head turning slightly as he looked back at Ethan, not questioning, not urging, but waiting, and in that quiet moment, the path forward became clear, not in detail, but in direction, because whatever had been hidden here was only the beginning, not the end. Ethan took one last look at the room, then reached out and closed the metal box, not to conceal it again, but to carry it forward, and as he stepped out into the hallway with Rex beside him, the air felt different, lighter in a way that suggested something had shifted, something had begun to move after years of stillness, and somewhere beyond the walls of the house, beyond the quiet road and the distant shoreline, there were answers that had not yet been uncovered, waiting not to be discovered by chance, but to be followed, one step at a time, by the only two who could finish what had been left undone. The hallway no longer felt like an entrance, it felt like a passage, and as Ethan stepped forward with the metal box held firmly in his hands, the weight of it settled differently now, no longer uncertain, but purposeful, as if it had shifted from being something discovered to something carried, and Rex moved ahead of him with a quiet confidence that had not been there before, his steps steady, his focus fixed not on the shadows or the walls, but on a direction only he seemed to understand. They passed back through the living room where the fading daylight pressed weakly against the windows, stretching long across the floor, and for a moment, Ethan paused, his eye scanning the space once more, not for answers, but for anything that might have been overlooked, any detail that did not belong, but everything remained still, unchanged, as if the house had already given what it needed to give. Rex did not stop, he moved toward the front door, then past it, veering slightly to the left, toward a narrow side corridor Ethan had barely noticed before, a passage that led toward the back of the house where the air felt cooler, thinner, and as Ethan followed, he realized that this path had not been part of his intention, but it had become part of his direction. The corridor opened into a smaller room, one that had once been a study or a sitting area, its windows partially covered by heavy curtains that filtered the light into a dull, muted glow, and against the far wall stood a tall wooden cabinet, its doors closed, its surface marked by time but still intact. Rex approached it without hesitation, stopping just inches away, his head tilting slightly as he studied it, then glancing back at Ethan in a way that was no longer questioning, but certain, as if this was the next step, not a guess, not a search, but a continuation. Ethan set the metal box down on a nearby table, his movements controlled, and stepped closer to the cabinet, his hand reaching for the handle, pausing only briefly before pulling it open. The hinges responded with a low, drawn-out sound, and inside, the shelves were mostly empty, save for a single object resting at the center, a map, folded but not sealed, its edges worn, its surface marked with lines and symbols that had been drawn by hand, not printed, not official, but deliberate. Ethan lifted it carefully, unfolding it just enough to reveal its contents, and what he saw did not resemble a standard layout or survey, but something more personal, a route, a path traced across terrain that was not immediately recognizable, with markings that indicated points of interest, locations that had meaning to whoever had drawn it. Rex leaned in closer, his nose hovering over one specific point on the map, his reaction immediate, focused, and Ethan followed his gaze, noting the mark, a small circle drawn darker than the rest, as if it had been emphasized, as if it mattered more than the others. A faint memory stirred then, not fully formed, just a sensation, the kind that comes from familiarity without context, and Ethan felt it settle in the same place where instinct lived, quiet but undeniable. He folded the map again, more carefully this time, and tucked it under his arm, his mind already shifting from discovery to action, because whatever this was, it was not meant to stay here, it was meant to be followed. Rex stepped back from the cabinet, turning toward the door, his body aligned with a direction that extended beyond the walls of the house, and as Ethan picked up the metal box once more, the pieces began to settle into place, not completely, not yet, but enough to understand that this was no longer about what had been hidden, it was about what needed to be found. And as they moved back through the house together, the fading light outside deepening into the early tones of evening, the quiet certainty between them grew stronger, because some paths are not chosen, they are recognized, and once seen, they cannot be ignored. The last light of day had begun to fade when Ethan stepped out onto the porch. The sky stretched wide in muted shades of blue and gray, and the air carried a sharper edge now, cooler, as if the evening itself had been waiting for them to move. And Rex paused at the top of the steps, his posture steady, his gaze fixed not on the house behind them, but on the narrow stretch of land that extended beyond the gravel road, toward a line of trees that stood dark against the horizon. Ethan adjusted his grip on the metal box and the folded map, feeling the weight of both settle into something familiar, something that no longer questioned his presence here, and for a moment, he looked back at the house, its windows dim, its structure quiet, not abandoned anymore, but completed in a way that did not need to be spoken. Rex moved first, stepping down from the porch and onto the gravel, his pace unhurried but certain, and Ethan followed, his boots crunching softly with each step, the sound fading quickly into the open space around them. The road stretched ahead for a short distance before narrowing into a worn path that curved gently toward the trees, a path that had not been used often, but not forgotten either, and as they approached it, Ethan unfolded the map once more, the paper catching the last traces of light, the markings clearer now that he understood what he was looking for. The circle Rex had focused on earlier aligned with a point beyond the tree line, not far in distance, but far enough to feel separate from the house, as if it had been intentionally placed just out of reach, waiting for someone willing to follow. Rex did not need the map, he moved forward with a quiet certainty, stepping onto the path and continuing without hesitation, his body aligned with the direction as if guided by something deeper than sight. And Ethan folded the map again, tucking it securely under his arm as he followed. The ground beneath them shifted from gravel to packed earth, the scent of pine and damp leaves rising with each step, the sounds of the open coast fading behind them as the trees closed in, their branches filtering the remaining light into soft, scattered patterns across the ground. The path wound gently, not steep, not difficult, but deliberate, as if it had been carved with purpose rather than convenience, and after a few minutes, the space began to open again, the trees thinning just enough to reveal a small clearing ahead. Rex slowed as they approached it, his steps becoming more measured, his attention sharpening, and when they reached the edge, he stopped completely, his body still, his gaze fixed on the center of the clearing where something stood, simple, quiet, and unmistakable. It was a marker, not large, not elaborate, just a weathered stone set into the ground, its surface worn by time but still bearing faint engravings that caught the dim light. Ethan stepped closer, the world around him seeming to quiet even further, as if the clearing itself held a kind of stillness that did not belong to the rest of the land, and he knelt slightly, brushing his fingers across the surface of the stone, clearing away a thin layer of dirt and leaves until the markings became visible. There was no long inscription, no detailed account, just a name, a date, and beneath it, a single line that had been carved with care, almost reverence, and as Ethan read it silently, something within him settled, not as a conclusion, but as an understanding, because this was not a place meant to be found by many, it was a place meant to be remembered by one. Rex stepped forward then, moving to the base of the stone, lowering himself gently onto the ground, his body relaxed but his gaze steady, and Ethan watched him for a moment, the connection between the dog, the house, and this place no longer something to question, but something to accept, because whatever had been hidden, whatever had been protected, it had led them here, not by chance, but by design. And as the last light of day slipped beyond the trees, leaving the clearing wrapped in a quiet, dim stillness, Ethan understood that the truth was no longer buried, it was here, waiting not to be uncovered, but to be honored. The quiet in the clearing did not feel empty, it felt complete, as if everything that had led them here had finally settled into place, and Ethan remained kneeling beside the stone a moment longer, his fingers resting lightly against its surface, feeling the roughness of the engraving, the subtle grooves carved by hands that had chosen to remember when others had chosen to forget. The name lingered in his mind, not just as a marker, but as a presence, someone who had stood, served, and been erased from the world except for this single, quiet place, and as he exhaled slowly, the weight of that realization did not press down on him, it steadied him, like a truth that no longer needed to be hidden. Rex shifted beside him, lowering his head gently until it rested near the base of the stone, his posture calm, his breathing even, and there was something in that stillness that spoke louder than anything written, something that did not need explanation, because whatever connection had brought him here had reached its end not in discovery, but in recognition. Ethan reached into the metal box, opening it once more, his movement slower now, deliberate, and he took out the worn collar, the one that had rested for years in silence, preserved with care, and he held it for a moment, feeling the texture of the leather, the faint imperfections worn into it by time and use, and then he placed it carefully at the base of the stone, beside Rex, not as an offering, but as a return, something that had been carried away and was now being brought back to where it belonged. The air shifted slightly then, not in temperature, but in presence, the kind of subtle change that does not demand attention but cannot be ignored once felt, and Ethan sat back on his heels, his gaze lifting toward the trees that surrounded the clearing, their outlines softened by the fading light, their branches swaying gently in a wind that had not been there a moment before. He did not speak, because there was nothing that needed to be said, not here, not now, and instead, he simply stayed, allowing the silence to hold its meaning, allowing the moment to exist without interruption. Rex lifted his head slightly, his ears flicking once, then settling again, his eyes soft but focused, and for the first time since they had entered the clearing, he looked away from the stone, glancing toward Ethan with a quiet steadiness that felt less like a question and more like an acknowledgement, as if something unspoken had been completed. Ethan nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and closed the metal box, not as a way of ending something, but as a way of carrying forward what remained, because not everything needed to stay behind to be honored, some things needed to be remembered in motion, in action, in the quiet choices that followed. He stood slowly, brushing the dust from his hands, and took one last look at the stone, the name, the line beneath it, now clear in his mind in a way it had not been before, and though he did not read it aloud, its meaning settled into him with a certainty that did not fade. Rex rose beside him, his body relaxed, his presence steady, and together they stepped back from the clearing, not in retreat, but in quiet departure, leaving the stone as it had always been, simple, still, and no longer alone. As they moved back toward the path, the trees parting slightly to guide them, the last traces of light slipping fully into dusk, Ethan felt something shift within him, not a burden, not a question, but a kind of clarity that only comes when something long hidden is finally brought into the open and allowed to exist without fear. The house behind them, the room, the objects, the map, all of it remained, but it no longer held the same weight, because the truth had already found its place, not in walls or in paper, but here, in the quiet space between memory and presence, where nothing needed to be proven to be real. And as they walked, side by side, the sound of their steps soft against the earth, the night settling gently around them, there was no need to look back, because some stories do not end when they are told, they end when they are finally understood, and in that understanding, something quiet and enduring takes its place, not as an ending, but as a kind of grace that remains long after the words are gone.